Greetings, everyone, and welcome to this talk on multi-level risk management using the Discipline Agile Toolkit. My name is Daniel Gagnon, and for the next 40 minutes or so, I'm going to share with you insights from my practice over the years around this subject using the Discipline Agile Toolkit. So this was the actual first cover slide for this using a perhaps a board game that many of you will recognize with the word risk in it. So this, by the way, is for this presentation is actually a premiere for PMI Slovenia. It's the first time I've given this talk. So when we get to the questions, bear that in mind. There might be some imperfections. This has not yet stood the test of time nor of multiple repetitions, but you do get to see it first. So there's always a trade-off, right? All right, a little bit about myself. I won't go on about this for too long. Career project manager, been in the Agile space since 2010 approximately, mostly in very large organizations, large banks, financial institutions in Canada. DA I discovered pretty much around at the very beginning of my Agile journey, around 2011, 2012. So I've been using the toolkit and teaching and practicing Discipline Agile for many, many years. I'm actually one of the two people in the world besides themselves that Scott Ambler and Mark Lyons named as PMI Discipline Agile Fellows. So in a sense, they recognized that I had reached sort of the same level of expertise as they had on this subject. Although they're still the authors, the creators, I don't pretend to be at their level in terms of new thought processes and new material, but I certainly over the years have contributed quite a bit. So enough about me. Let's move straight on into today's agenda. The first thing I'm going to do is give you a hyperspeed, and I do mean hyperspeed. We're not going to take too much time, but I want to give you my overview of DA. So what I've learned in the trenches over several years, almost 10 of working in the DA space. I just want to give you a sense of how I view it and how I define it. And I think you'll find it helpful for the material around specific material around risks that will follow. I do want to also do a little tiny chapter on risk and agile in general, because done well with a proper mindset, an agile approach will capture it and see to a lot of risk management strategies in and of itself. Then we'll get into the specifics of what this talk is about. So DA and risk, and the title says it all, multi-level. So we'll look at the enterprise level, the level of governance, where more of a PMO and project level, and team delivery level. So here we go. Here is a sort of hyperspeed overview of DA. The first thing to understand, obviously, about DA is that it is basically, it looks across the entire organizational ecosystem. If we unpack this image for a minute, at the bottom you have the foundational elements such as your life cycles, guidelines, teams, ways of working, etc. The sort of middle area here is where Discipline Agile got to start. Discipline Agile delivery. Back in 2012, at the time of the first book, first book was called Discipline Agile Delivery. It was just about teams delivering, small teams delivering in an agile way. Over the years, it has grown to encompass not only what has now become Discipline Agile DevOps, but also entire value streams, and very, very important, and what I've been delving in a lot in my practice, is the Discipline Agile Enterprise. This is an extremely important concept, because we know that IT never was really the constraint. If you looked at an enterprise value stream from beginning to end from a customer perspective, if you look at although this is not relative to time spent, but just that the part where agile teams would work in disciplined agile delivery or any kind of agile delivery, working on consumable solutions is actually a very small part of the overall equation. And it goes down to the lean principle that, if you're optimizing only a part of the whole, you're sub-optimizing the entire system. So even going 100% faster in small teams has little effect on the full lead time if you're taking 18, 24 months to get a business idea to the point where it is ready to be worked on by your IT folks. And then pre-DevOps, if it took 6 months to 8 months before you could actually deploy it. So IT is no longer the constraint, especially from a continuous integration, continuous delivery, DevOps point of view. It never really was, because the business could take quite some time before really reaching an effective sort of transposition of their needs. And getting back now to what DA at that level was, if you look at the goals of discipline agile delivery, for example, even at the time where it was only delivery focused, even then it was based around method agnostic goals like forming your team, exploring scope, developing test strategy, coordinating activities, improving your quality, and across phases. We'll see those later. But since the beginning, it has always been about achieving goals in a method agnostic way. In other words, DA is not a framework, it's a process tailoring and decision toolkit. And I've used the address changing stakeholder needs process blade here. This is what DA calls basically your higher level choices with different sub decisions that need to be made. This is a process blade. So DA is not a framework, because frameworks, and all frameworks are well intended, because this can look like chaos to the uninitiated if you don't have a sort of a DA guide to or a DA thought process to work you through it. These choices have always existed. So over the years, various creators of various frameworks have said, how can we simplify this for people, right? So how can we get people to an agile method and sort of hide this complexity, or not hide it, well, protect people from this complexity, I guess, protect, right? I don't know what, but at any rate, without being ill-intended, what happens is all frameworks make the decision for you before you even begin in terms of these choices. And that looks like, basically, that looks like the following. It looks like a sort of Panama Papers or WikiLeaks redacted document, right? If we could see this, live, basically the framework creators have now crossed out what they don't believe is what they believe is not a good choice for their framework. So what you wind up with when you are following or trying to implement a framework is you're implementing these practices, but without really knowing why nor understanding what your other options were. So you wind up with this very limited palette. And this very limited palette is also kind of the reason why, if you look at the various frameworks, each of the different frameworks will come up with different choices here, but they will still be limited choices. So this is where we get the methodology wars, like prioritize who prioritizes work, according to this framework, it's that person, according to another framework, it's a team, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, by the way, this is not meant, the choices here are not meant to correspond to any specific method or approach. All right. So, and if you want to look at this another way, remember at the beginning where we had a fulsome list as DA presented it. Here's another way of looking at this. Here's a faux sort of combination between Kinevin and a Stacy diagram. So what I mean by that is on the level of complexity and scope volatility, I'm going from simple to complicated to complex to chaos here, just to give you sort of a lay of the ground. I have now superimposed actual sort of approaches or methods, and where their choices tend to make them live. So for instance, if you're going to use lean startup, you're probably your choices, the choices that lean startup made for you are far more appropriate to a context that is complex and even slightly chaotic than it would be, for a simple solution where traditional sequential waterfall, if it's something, not too complicated from a technology perspective, something that you understand the scope well, something that you've done repeatedly in your organization, why would you even want to impose an agile change tax on? Keep doing that. And DA recognizes sequential sort of waterfall ways of working as every bit as legitimate as any sort of agile choices. In fact, if you look at this red circle with PMI Discipline Agile here, basically Discipline Agile, because it exposes choices and process decisions across all of history, basically, and exposes them and makes them available to you, covers everything, right? It's an umbrella, and the frameworks have made their decisions here, but everything is within the umbrella of Discipline Agile. It is therefore impossible to actually be doing Discipline Agile. If you say we're doing Discipline Agile, we're a Discipline Agile shop, that can't be, right? Because your Discipline Agile shop could be completely different from the next person's Discipline Agile shop. So there's no such thing. And look how this sort of mental model can also be reproduced at the program scale. So you have Nexus and Scrum at Scale and SAFe and LESS. Exact same model. These frameworks make choices, and these choices are dependent on or reflect the sort of level of complexity or complicatedness that your context reflects. And basically, Discipline Agile, again, you can't do Discipline Agile. Discipline Agile just shows you all your choices, right? So very important to understand that. And we'll get into what the repercussions of that are a bit later. So no matter the framework or the way of working that is in place, be it a single framework or a so-called at-scale framework, right? So even if you are in a situation where, without even knowing your choices have been made for you, you can trot out the DA toolkit now and look at the things that aren't working for you. And basically, you can get rid of the Sharpie ink. You can use DA to restore access to your options and start thinking for yourself. And I start exerting critical thinking within your organization. And this is extremely important because, we've all heard the term resilience, companies need to be resilient these days. I go way beyond that. Option awareness is the absolute single most important thing. It's the currency of anti-fragility, according to Nassim Nicholas Taleb. Anti-fragility is what people actually want when they talk about resilience. They just don't know. People talk about resilience as being getting better after a storm, or getting better after something like COVID-19, or a new normal after COVID-19, or they talk about it. But resilience is the wrong word. Resilient just means you go back exactly to the spot you were. A rubber ball is resilient. You squeeze it, it goes back to being a rubber ball. And if you're anti-fragile due to your option awareness, you could emerge from something like COVID-19 completely different company. But that's a subject for another talk, which I've already given in the past and which I will give again in the future. Let's move on. So that was my sort of hyperspeed introduction to my way of explaining DA. You can't do DA, you can only use DA to uncover options that frameworks, though well-intended, have covered up and hidden from you. Another piece of groundwork we need to lay in order to be fair is basically risk and Agile in general. So what do I mean by that? Well, when we're talking projects and even products, it doesn't matter. There are 5 core project risks that we encounter, and the practitioners amongst you will recognize all of these. Number 1 is intrinsic schedule flaw, right? When we have wrong estimates or things are infeasible from the project start based on hope, right? We have all been in situations where our organizations have been sort of guilty of this. Specification breakdown. That's when you can't seem to achieve stakeholder consensus. You can't seem to agree on what to build or final product criteria. Results in a lot of change requests, a lot of back and forth. Scope creep. That's a favorite. Scope creep is a favorite sort of PMO PMO specter. Additional requirements that inflate without control, but what you additionally agreed upon. And scope creep comes from the fact that we've basically gotten our stakeholder used to very punitive change request paradigms. So they try to, while the hood is up, they try to get as many changes in as possible. Personnel loss, obviously, but not just any personnel with key knowledge, critical people. And productivity variation, right? Obviously, productivity variation. We think we can do like so much a month, but in the end result, we only get a third of that done. A lot of that due to multitasking. Now, agility at large in general, according, to the mindset, values, and principles, well done, addresses these things, right? The schedule flaw is addressed by shorter durations, relative sizing, incremental delivery. These things reduce that core risk in well thought out, well applied Agile. Same thing for the rest of them, specification breakdown. When we have customer collaboration over small pieces of work, and we do prioritize constantly. Scope creep, well, there's multiple planning events in many Agile approaches, and they tend to be product centric. Right? We review the product, we demo it. Personnel loss, obviously, this comes down to another favorite subject of mine, employee engagement. And obviously you're going to get more people engaged if they are on self-organizing teams to a certain extent, where there's collective ownership, where there's a bit of agency, collaboration, and sustainable place, that we're not doing 80-hour-a-week death marches. Finally, productivity variation, right? We do have process-centric events as opposed to product-centric events in Agile approaches. So we have retrospective stand-ups. We can look at teams burn up, burn down, cumulative flow diagrams. There's just more instrumentation, more real-time instrumentation into well-done Agile. So I wanted to point that out because these intrinsic sort of built-in ways of addressing risk are present in Agile. So let's get into, and this is where I will share some practical experience, DA and the multiple levels of risk that we want to address with it. So the first off, obviously, is enterprise risk. First thing to understand is that DA does not view the corporate functions as dragons to be avoided. So rather it views, that higher level layer of at the top of the first sort of diagram that I showed, and we're going to see again in a minute. These are valued peers and partners. They're team members. They're part of the DA idea of enterprise awareness. Make sure of that we treat these people as valued peers and partners. So we saw, right, that Agile is no longer the constraint for organizational agility. By the way, I use the term organizational agility rather than business agility. Two reasons. Number one, not everything is business. You have governance, you have, you have all kinds of different not-for-profit, all kinds of different bodies that are not businesses. And second of all, it makes it sound like, well, you IT folks have been at this Agile thing for 25 years and you've obviously failed. So step aside, the adults in the room are taking over. We're calling it business agility. Now you dance to our tune. So it sounds as if, you failed, it's our turn to try. It just sounds so wrong, and for those two reasons. Organizational agility suffers from none of that, and it's clear. So let my position be recorded that, I encourage you to use the term organizational agility and make it replace business agility. Neither here nor there. Let's move on. So let's take a look at some real world examples of addressing enterprise level risk using a DA approach that I have been participant in, or that I have initiated, or that I have been part and parcel of. And these are the upper elements, the enterprise architecture, people management. These are the process blades at the enterprise and value stream level. So we're going to look at a few of those. Let's look at, for example, risk control points in a large financial institution. So risk control points basically are specific control points as addressed. You can find control points in the PMI's risk standard, for example. Control points address specific risks, and in financial institutions or any other regulated industry, you need to document how you are addressing these control points. They touch upon many things. They touch upon business operations, your IT, your governance. If you're doing a transformation or an evolution, they need to be documented, and obviously for reasons of continuous improvement. So let's look at a specific example. Here's an illustrative process flow I'm going to walk you through using basically a real example in a real organization. I've just changed things and made it very anonymous. Basically, moving from a story map right down to using JIRA stories and JIRA issue types, basically, as a way to integrate risk, compliance, and other corporate function partners and team members right into our everyday working as an agile team. In other words, using enterprise awareness and agility's concept of supporting team members to not interact with the corporate risk function as an external body to be feared, but rather as partners to be valued and brought on board. So we had this, right from the get-go, when we had a story map for an idea for an idea and fleshed it out and got funding. Well, we'd work with the control partners, the PO of the team. We'd look at the next release, look at user stories that could trigger risk control points, tag them, and we'd actually work with our risk partners to perform their risk assessments, identify them, create a risk log, and link those risks to the stories. Right. So let's see how that looked basically. So here's a story around entering order info in an app, right? Or be it mobile or online or web, doesn't matter. And we would tag basically the control partners, in this case, compliance and privacy, and I've removed acronyms that could have identified the institution here. Who do we need to basically subscribe to this story? So in other words, rather than being sort of off in an ivory tower, these folks would then, just like a developer on the team, get updates on the story and be able to put in their own updates on the story based on, how they had been working on the risk associated with this story. And basically, we could actually create from that risk issue types that we created and that we broke down into, as you can see here, tasks, right? So now basically the compliance and the risk folks are actually, their work is documented and estimated, and is just as important a part of the workflow for the entire team. They have become supporting team members for however iterations that they are specifically assigned. We even created basically, there are plugins, and we'll see a bit more about that later. We can use, there are plugins, have been for years in Jira, where you can have basically risk burn downs, risk indexes, and we use those features and those plugins to create this sort of type of visual. And from that, there is even another issue type called mitigation plan with mitigation tasks. So why is this in essence, we said to ourselves, why should risk be treated any differently than a development epic, right? So basically all this means that, and it's not, as we saw, we had various, partners. So it could have been a privacy story. It could have been privacy mitigation. It could have been a compliance with, for example, do not spam. It doesn't matter. The specifics of the story don't matter. What matters is we brought the risk folks and all these partners in as members of the team. Second example, completely different place too, different institution. Agile HR, which touches upon obviously at least these aspects: people management, continuous improvement. So basically, we worked with in this particular case, we worked with an institution in a couple of ways. First of all, we actually worked with HR and treated them as an agile team, and started basically using more of a we started off with an iterative approach, but we actually we're moving towards basically more of a Kanban approach. But and here, David, in this case, this place was not using Jira, they were using TFS now as their DevOps server, but basically created a whole bunch of stories on their own way of working, how to better achieve better flow and throughput. They were working as individual contributors. There wasn't enough teamwork. We took them from from absolutely no agile knowledge to working together as an agile team. Transparency and sharing and swarming things, and entering their stories in as their DevOps. And it took a while, but they loved it, and they became quite a bit more productive. But the important thing with a function, a corporate function like HR, is also basically how we get them to improve their interactions with the rest of the organization. So we held workshops around that, and here's for example, we used the Pia Maria Thoren's really good book on the subject. And we work with HR. So listen, you're responsible for all of this, leadership programs, development, change management, organization development. You are an incredibly important partner to have. So basically, we need to have you interacting as agile a way as possible with the rest of the organization. So one area that we worked on that was, to me, very indicative of this and was a success was they had to rewrite dozens of job profiles to make them to make the I guess the criteria more explicitly agile in terms of the way the types of candidates they were looking for. And their first reaction, obviously, was we're going to write these dozens of profiles and we're going to release them all at once in 10 months. And basically, myself and the rest of the coaching team said, not a very good idea, because you're not being agile in your way of working here. Why don't? And we help them come to this realization. It would be much bigger if they a much better way of working if they. Why don't you just work on one? Find a hiring manager, work with her, and work on the criteria and see if your rewrite attracts a better kind of candidate. Learn from that, and then you can actually basically improve and do the others. And you don't have to do I don't know, it was 30, between 30 and 40 job profiles. Do them a bit at a time. The very first one would be an MVP, and the rest would be minimum business increments, as Discipline Agile calls it, or minimum marketable features. But don't stop with the get away from the big bang approach. And so that was incredibly eye-opening to them. And they were able to apply that approach successfully, and they did get hiring managers. This is going on for a while now. Whenever I check in with this particular organization now, those job profiles have tremendously improved the type of candidate that they attract. At the very least, they've succeeded in not attracting some of the candidates they don't necessarily have any intention of hiring. So it's been successful in winnowing out and reducing the number of interviews that are necessary. So in both of the examples we just saw and the ones we're going to see moving forward, I just decided to put this here. The DA mindset is what drives this type of collaboration with control functions across the enterprise. And that is distributed amongst what DA calls principles, promises, and guidelines. But you look at these, it's a bit small, but be pragmatic, optimize flow, enterprise awareness, create psychological safety and embrace diversity, collaborate proactively, attend to relationships, create effective environments that foster joy, change culture by improving the system, leverage and enhance organizational assets. Again, enterprise awareness. I came across an article the other day by a so-called Agile coach, and it was about risk actually. And there were some very good ideas around how a small Agile team could go about addressing risk. But halfway into the article, the author went complete 20th century Agile and threw in something, a sentence that to me invalidated anything else he had to say. He said, at all costs, avoid gatekeepers. In other words, this risk stuff, this risk business, you're a small Agile team, it belongs to you. No managers, no corporate control functions. Keep the gatekeepers away. Make sure your Scrum Master defends you from that. That didn't work in 1986. It didn't work in 1993. It didn't work in 2000. Why would it work in 2021? That is spectacularly bad advice still coming in 2021 from so-called Agile coaches. You need to be enterprise aware. You need to collaborate. You need to treat control function as team members. I'm going to give you another example right now with governance risk. So one thing to be very clear about, the one thing Discipline Agile tends to be, the one area where it tends to be a tiny bit prescriptive is around introducing lightweight governance. And this is as prescriptive as it gets. And all it says basically is it recognizes that, Agile needs an inception phase. It's that simple. And you know what? The Agile community recognized that also. They call it Sprint Zero, except that, every Scrum exam I've ever taken has a trick question whereby they try to trap you into using Sprint Zero because you will lose points. Scrum's stated position is there is no Sprint Zero in Scrum. At any rate, Discipline Agile recognizes that there are phases in Agile. You need to get a product together. You need to build it. And you need to get it in front of your clients. And this happens to correspond with the same sort of phases that a waterfall sequential approach takes, except that planning and execution are together in construction. Where a sequential approach had very output-based gates, to use the gatekeeper approach from my previous comment. What DA uses is basically, these very outcome-oriented gates, basically. So once you have inception, you get out of inception when your stakeholders are all aligned and you agree, right? It doesn't have to be a long project chart. It can be 1 page as long as you've actually gotten that agreement. And proven architecture here is something that DA introduces. I've seen sort of something similar in other in approaches like SAFe is interesting in that it brings in the idea of architectural runway. DA takes that and other ideas and has been for years saying, well, if you want to reduce risk, basically one of the first things you need to do in construction is make sure you can actually build this thing. So why don't you take the first few iterations and build a walking skeleton? Again, walking skeleton of architecture has been around as an idea for a long time. It's basically, don't try to prove your architecture in Visio, prove it with code, even if it's just a bunch of windows, DOS type windows saying, ping, I am here, I have received your response, right? Just show that it can be built. So very important, just proven architecture sort of basically governance milestone. A couple more sort of governance milestone along those lines. You're going to need to work with a PMO. PMO needs to be a bimodal, multimodal PMO, which can, play on multiple sort of ways of delivering. So maybe your rolling average of velocity stability is one thing. Certainly I've yet another financial institution, this is what I use rather than straight stability. And I want to know if you're getting predictable. I don't want to hear your number of points. The same thing for cumulative flow diagram. That's a great way to see if you're keeping your throughput in check and keeping your WIP down. It's really all about having consistent metric categories. Here's another example from another client where we basically, you want to know if your backlog is healthy, if you're delivering value, and on time within sort of a semblance of a budget, and on time in terms of your initial release map. It's not true that there's no release map or there's no overarching idea of where you're going in Agile. There should be, and even risk. The thing is, right, you can actually populate, red, amber, green dashboards like this. The underlying triggers for the colors will be context specific according to the project, according to the team, right? For example, in the schedule, it won't be all CPI, and in the cost, it won't be all SPI. That's cost and schedule indexes in the traditional world, but you could be using completely Agile and different Agile metrics, cumulative flow or velocity stability or any number of others to actually trigger these. The important thing is, if for a traditional, for an interim period, you're still going to be using this approach, well, don't fight it. Just populate it differently, trigger it differently. Getting to a specific example now of working with folks in the governance realm, I had a very good experience with just asking. Sometimes is incredible. The power of just asking. So we had this one project in one of my clients where basically we heard that it was a big Agile project, and lo and behold, the call comes down that we're going to be audited, and everybody immediately, oh my God, the auditors. Well, it's the internal auditors. They shouldn't, by definition, sort of be on our side, right? They're on our team. So what we did basically is we got in touch with the audit folks and said, listen, we're experimenting with a lot of different ways of working here, and for it to make sense to your from an audit perspective, we'd like to invite you to be part of our team. Invite one auditor to be part of our team for like 5 weeks. Do you think you could spare the time? Because it would be a very good sort of test case of how you could audit our Agile endeavors moving forward. And they said yes. So basically what we obtained was that the person joined our team and sat with us and was part and did stand-ups with us and looked at Jira with us. And basically what we did was we showed her, initial business requirements, and we were using Confluence, and we showed her how we could link those large requirements and break them down, decompose them into stories in Jira, and how those stories in Jira got worked on and basically, they got built automatically, and automatic regression testing, and the binary was created, and then, that stuff would go into a staging environment and then finally released to production. How each tool in that CI/CD sort of chain had audible traces, including Jira. And long story short, by working with us and observing and learning about everything we were doing, she got back to her department and said, listen, this Agile team is doing the most audible workflow I've ever seen. So it became, the test case was very successful, and we never had problems after that with, oh my God, they're going to audit our Agile way of working. No, because we made that person a supporting team member, and we're completely transparent. So we have to stop thinking that, these folks are the enemy, or in the words of that so-called Agile coach, avoid gatekeepers at all costs. What do you think would have happened if we'd had shunned our internal auditor? Well, anyone you shun is going to find a way to get back at you, right? And that's when they would have found findings and show me this and show me that, and they would have not been very pleasant with us. It would not have been teamwork. So finally, a couple of words around sort of delivery risk. This is where we live, where I showed you how DA has sort of delivery level objectives and process blades. But I just want to look at the address risk process blade, which is an ongoing sort of, and look at these sort of. I want to look at a couple of the sort of the the process decisions and choices we have here. And this is in the last few slides here. So very quickly wrap this up. Classifying risks, documenting them, and how to show them. So I mentioned earlier that at one point we were using Jira plugins to create risk registers and so on. So this is an example that was years ago. So now there are quite a few actual add-ons to a tool like Jira, and otherwise you could do it in any tool. But for risk registers and a risk burn down basically is interesting. It's the same idea as basically a scope burn down or an iteration burn down, except that you're looking at how you're burning your risk. How many risks are you closing, mitigating, avoiding, etc. So that's a very interesting way of going about it. So even the Agile industrial complex in the form of the tools is acknowledging that building your risk management right into your Agile workflow is a very good idea. And finally, from an information radiator point of view, this is it's an example of a story mapping tool I use called Stories on Board. This is sort of a generic evolutionary, the basis that I, for evolving a company's way of working. But in this case, the pink cards are stories where there's also a little bit of risk involved. So I've just simply identified that. Everybody can see it right away. So it's a way of, establishing conversations around that. So there would be a lot more to cover, but we're pretty much at time. So I'd like to thank you very much. Please feel free to look me up and connect with me on LinkedIn. There's my email address, and I'll be available. And once we get to the question period, hopefully you'll have some questions that I can answer live. It'll be my pleasure. Thank you.